Thank you very much for a very kind and a little bit strange introduction. It's good to be here at the Students for Liberty conference. There's another conference happening this week, the Australian Liberal Students Federation. I don't think they're going to be quite as ideologically pure as this group of people in this room. I've been asked today just to give you a few thoughts about why I think it's important that young people are involved in the liberty movement. I think to some extent I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think it is really, really important that young people are involved for a number of reasons. There are some practical reasons for this, of course, because libertarianism, classical liberalism is seen as being the ideology for old, rich, white guys. But I think that's bullshit. The last speaker you heard from was Julie, and now me, a young, poor, well, I'm still white and I'm still male, but you get my point. That sloppy excuse for analysis, I think, ignores what the libertarian movement is in fact all about. It's an ideology which is based on the idea that every individual has the right to express themselves and that they should be empowered to live their own life in any way that they see fit. It doesn't pick winners, and it does create them. It recognises that everyone is different, they've got different needs and values and interests. It doesn't seek to impose any particular view about morality onto the general population. I recognise that that's a good thing. If I was to impose my view about arts, for instance, onto the general population, I think the world would be a poorer place. Not everyone wants to listen to Miley Cyrus and Kesha. And not everyone thinks modern art is, to borrow a phrase, absolute crap. There was an unmade bed that was sold for over $4 million this week. This is more important for young people, I think, than many other demographics. We often get the feeling as young people that we're forgotten by politics or politicians or the party system. I think that's why people have previously turned to socialism. They feel that it gives them a place in the political landscape, but I think that's an illusion. Socialist policies, when they're directed at young people that seek to level the playing field for us, really fall at the first hurdle. As we all know, they don't achieve their aims, and they very often create far bigger problems than those that they seek to remedy. But the real area, I think, where the libertarian movement can offer young people a new home is in offering its policy prescriptions, or lack thereof, on issues that they care about. One of the most important things that libertarians can offer is a view of the world that captures the imagination of young people. For too long, I think conservatives and the right in politics in particular have ceded the ground on compassion and kindness to socialism and the left. This hasn't always been the case. 17 years before Adam Smith wrote his most famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, he published his thoughts on the moral underpinnings of his vision of human economic interaction in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He famously said, "The rich select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the soul in which they propose from the labours of all the thousands of whom they employ, be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species." In very 1759 language, he's talking about, beyond, I think, the moral absolutism that a lot of us feel draws us to libertarianism. I think it's Smith's explanation of how aggregate self-interest in fact serves the community. It's probably why many of us subscribe to a libertarian philosophy. This, I think, is the key message that we need to be drilling into young people. It's the message that they need to hear about libertarianism. We need to do more, all of us in this room, to sell the morality, essentially, of liberty and the almost incredible gains that it can offer. There's evidence to suggest that this is already happening. Various polls in the United States, for instance, show a trend that young people are slowly moving towards the liberty movement. Earlier this year, the Washington Post noted the rise of the libertarian caucus within the Republican Republican Party, most of these people are young. A poll released by the Public Religion Research Institute in October 2013 showed that 22% of Americans consider themselves libertarian or lean libertarian. 45% of libertarians side with Republicans, while 5% identify as Democrats. 53% of libertarians consider themselves reliable primary voters. A CNN poll from 2011 had 63% of respondents saying government was doing too much. It might be pretty low. But a poll commissioned by the Harvard Institute of Politics last year found the majority of 18 to 29-year-olds don't want government collecting any of their personal information data. A new Pew Research poll found that 69% of millennials think marijuana should be legalised. Philip Bump at the Atlantic Wire summed up Pew's findings, saying that if that portrait holds, it's not terrible news for conservatives. It is terrible news for conservatives if it fits with the growth of political libertarians. This trend could see a libertarian selected as the GOP presidential candidate as early as 2016. I think the story is similar here in Australia. The prominence of organisations and individuals dedicated to liberty in this country has grown to unprecedented levels over the last few years. My own experience at the Institute of Public Affairs, I've seen membership double over the last few years. Many young people in the Liberal Party identify as libertarian. I don't think this has happened in the past, and certainly if you look at the sorts of policies that were being put up by young people within the party even 10 years ago, it's an extraordinary growth in the libertarian movement. And of course there are organisations like this one, Students for Liberty, which has finally reached the shores of Australia. I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I think if those of us who are involved can keep taking the Gospels of Hayek and Friedman and Bastiat and Rothbard to our peers, ours will be the generation that sees government start to step out of our lives and back into its very small pockets. Thank you. So I thought with the rest of our time, I could take questions from the floor and hear what your views are and tell you what mine are as well. So, is there any questions? Hi.
How do you find working within the Liberal Party down here? I'm from Queensland with the LNP and found it completely insufferable.
Yeah, sure. So I work at the Institute of Public Affairs. I've sort of got two hats. I work at the Institute of Public Affairs, and some of you will also know that I'm president of the Victorian Young Liberals in this state. It's actually really, really great in Victoria. We're very, very lucky that we've got a committed group of people that are libertarians. They identify as either classical liberals or libertarians. Conservatives are essentially on the outer. And the great hope that I've got, particularly in Victoria, I'm not sure if this is true for other divisions, and I hear from people in Queensland and maybe New South Wales that this isn't the case, but certainly in Victoria, I hope that holds over the next 20 years. I'm really concerned that we keep that tradition going because it's not yet, I think, at the point where it's going to be self-replicating into sort of 10 years' time. But my experience in the Liberal Party in Victoria has been exceptionally good from a libertarian perspective. Obviously, I don't think that translates at the senior party level, and if it is going to happen in the Liberal Party, it's going to be our generation that does it, but that's one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about the future. I've found it's amazing to me that someone like myself is invited to come and speak at a conference like this, and I've got the position that I do. Margie is another one who's so involved in the libertarian movement in Australia, and she's on the executive. There are a number of other people who identify with these values who previously would have been shunned or certainly would have felt comfortable expressing these sorts of ideas. So I think it's extraordinarily positive. Hi, John.
G'day. It's great that there are so many libertarians and young libs down in Victoria. I'm curious about how the non-libertarians perceive the libertarians inside the Liberal Party. Do they see you as someone that disagrees on a few issues but generally a friend, or are you an enemy to be feared, or the Santorum versus Breheny?
Everyone likes
that. There's a continuum. So there are some people who think that we are the worst possible thing that can happen to the Liberal Party and we need to be excised as soon as possible. And there are others that think that it's appropriate that both Libertarians and Conservatives exist within the party because there are lots of things that we agree on. But for those that think that gay marriage is the worst thing that we could ever do, there are people like that exist, and they think that Libertarians are the worst. And they shouldn't piss off. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Simon. So, just wondering if you could perhaps distill from your experience, perhaps one or two key themes or messages that you would use or you found yourself to be most effective in conveying and persuading the liberty curious, as it were, towards liberal ideas. Any perspectives there? Including your IPA experience.
Yeah. There's one thing that I think turns a lot of people off, and I think Libertarians are, for the most part, aware of this, but it's hard for us, I think, to get past it. I think a lot of the time when we argue with people or we're having discussions with people, I think people perceive us to be quite arrogant. We seem to have... and I think a part of that problem is that we seem to... One of the things that I think it's difficult for Libertarians to convey is that our policy prescriptions are just the starting point, right? Government getting out of our lives is just the beginning to all of the complexity in life that comes from you and I and everyone else interacting. And I think it's hard for people to realise that government gets out of people's lives and don't become the provider of solutions so that others can do it. We don't have to know how a particular market is going to operate. We just have to know that it's possible for one to operate. Government gets out of the way and allows for all of those intricacies to go on. So I think part of it is just explaining to people that really basic idea that we're not about policy prescriptions. We're actually not about providing solutions. We're about, at best, we're about providing a framework so that solutions can be provided by others. So that's part of it. But I think the other part of it is interacting with people you're never going to convince someone of your point of view by calling them an idiot. And I think a lot of us tend to do that. I've definitely done it. It gets very frustrating that people don't see the obvious reality of libertarianism. Like, it's so clearly.
I get it every day in the IPA.
With your colleagues. So I think getting beyond that and just realising that there are people out there who might come around to our point of view, and as you say, are liberty curious. I love that phrase. But aren't quite there yet and need a little bit of coaxing to come around to our point of view. It's just going about discussing these things in a rational way rather than shoving your ideas down their throat and calling them a status quo. When even sometimes they are.
In terms of outcomes, the Liberal Party hasn't achieved a whole lot in terms of reducing the size of government and reducing spending. Where do you think the role of the LDP and various other kind of small government or semi-libertarian crossbench parties, fit within the political spectrum?
Yeah, I think, having David Lionhelm in the Senate is going to, I think, do wonders. I think it's going to be a great thing. One of the things that having an LDP senator will do, and Bob Day on economic issues as well, is going to be excellent. One of the things that it will allow is for the expression of libertarianism within the Liberal Party. So it will give people much more confidence to come out and say, I agree with what Bob Day is saying about industrial relations, for instance. Something that extraordinarily over the last few years the Liberal Party shied away from. I think the feeling in the Liberal Party though is that, and the problem that David in particular has, is that there's a really strong feeling that David doesn't deserve to be there, and I think that's a huge problem. The reason why a lot of people think that he doesn't deserve to be there is because they feel as though people donkey voted. He donkey voted his way into the Senate, which is not true. David recognises himself that there were people who confused him for the Liberal Party or for other parties. but that doesn't give you the kind of vote that you got. And at the end of the day, we either see voters as being stupid or we see them as rational. I think you've got a huge problem, a much, much deeper problem with democracy if you think that they're so stupid that they confuse the LDP for the Liberal Party. And if that's your position, then you need to consider why you believe in democracy. But I think it will be a positive thing. I've spoken to members of the Liberal parliamentary members of the Liberal Party who have said that they think it's a good thing because it will allow them to express themselves as Liberals within the party. And we'll see what happens over the next few years and how that plays out in a policy perspective. But obviously, I mean, you know, the very practical thing is even if it has no effect at all on the Liberal Party, they've got 2 votes in the Senate.
So do you think it will increase the Liberal Party's share of the vote, or do you think it will further divide the left and the right?
I mean, this it depends on which way the LDP goes in terms of does it try and capture votes. As I understand it, this is a strategy question from an LDP perspective. Do you go after the Greens votes or do you go after disaffected rural country party, National Party votes? You know, do you put yourself up as being the party that the Greens have over the last few years of being socially progressive? Or do you talk about freedom of speech and economic rationalism and that sort of thing? That's a strategy question for David. I think they have this.
Well, I'm just wondering, when it comes to dowry or young people coming to the term, do you believe that indoctrination of school children could be very consequent? I've never heard of pieces or higher back in high school or most of this stuff. Other throughout history, it's kind of just plain left-wing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a socialist until, you know, very recently. The only reason why that was is because I'd never heard of these people. I'd never heard of these ideas. I grew up in a community where, you know, I grew up in Castlemaine in central Victoria, and they're all hippies up there, and they love the Greens, and my family was the same, and the school I went to, you know, who of us have heard, I mean, I don't know if there's any school where they teach Hayek and Mises and Rothbard, and that's laughable. But I think that's particularly the case for a lot of young people who go through, I mean, you go to university. Luckily for me, I went through university, and that was the time at which I started reading much more and learned about these sort of ideas and realised they actually fit with my values with it. But it took a long time to get there, and you know, not everyone goes down that same path. So yeah, absolutely, it's a massive impediment to bringing people across. The only way that we change that is by deregulating education, and deregulating education curriculum, so that schools can teach whatever they like. I mean, I would love to run a free market school. That would be the greatest, you know, the greatest thing I could do in my life. It'd be great to be able to fight that sort of stuff with, you know, your own power of indoctrination. Tim, sorry.
The word libertarian is now making its way into the mainstream media, but it's particularly hostile, like the ABC, Fairfax, and even elements of News Limited, as they always seem to take, what the worst possible outcome that libertarianism can lead to, like, I used to call racism and all those sort of things. So how do you, once you get into the mainstream, how do you overcome the establishment media and also academia, who everyone thinks are gods?
Yeah, it's rare that you see libertarianism without extreme or radical or some other descriptor like that. And it's a real shame. But there's not much that you can do about it with some news agencies. Working at the IPA, it's interesting to see how the IPA is described. So there'll be some journalists that will say right-wing think tank, there'll be some journalists that say conservative think tank. We describe ourselves and we think of ourselves as being a free market think tank. But it doesn't matter how many times you tell some journalists that we're a free market think tank. We tell them every time we give them a comment. It's on our website. Nowhere on our website describe us as right wing or conservative. But they're always going to put their own spin on it. The way to fight that is to defund the ABC, not buy The Age and Fairfax. And if you do see it in News Limited, then that's. I think News Limited is the best that we've got. And there are people at News Limited who do an excellent job and who would describe themselves as being libertarian. So I doubt that there are many at The Age or Sydney Morning Herald. But I mean, just like anything, you've just got to fight for it. You've got to fight to tell people what we really stand for. And saying that we don't want restrictions on people being able to express certain views doesn't mean we're in favour of. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's illogical to say that we're in favour of racism. Okay, we're in favour of racism if we allow for free speech, but we're also in favour of all of these people who call the racists idiots. It's an illogical ad hominem attack, and it's something that you've just got to fight every time that you see it. And I think it will change. It'll change. It's been an unpopular idea for a while, and it's going to change, and so they're going to take time for us to change it. But a really helpful thing, I think, would be to pull journalists up every time they do it. It takes 2 seconds to send an email to a journalist and say, well, actually, you're not right. Libertarianism. Yeah, I mean, you can write it. You can have a form response that you can send to journalists. I think that would be a really good thing to do. But it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time. All right.
So going back to young people, what practical things do you think we should be doing? What's the most important things that young people can be doing now to
Yeah. I think we've got to recruit. We've got to recruit our friends, and we've got to recruit people that we know and people that we hang out with. And it's a difficult thing to do. And you can really only do it, I think, by demonstrating to people what works and what doesn't. Julie mentioned earlier Uber. I think Uber is one of these amazing disruptive technologies which is leading to, I mean, if you compare, I take Uber now everywhere and I never take cabs. If you line these things up side by side and you explain to people that the regulatory state is trying to step in and stop Uber from operating, I think that is a really clear, practical way of understanding why liberty is a good idea and the outcomes that can come from liberty. A lot of people aren't there with the moral autonomy question. They're not. Those sorts of moral absolutes aren't going to get through to them. But the practical consequences of either having regulations that disallow this sort of technology or not having them and allowing for technologies like this to exist, I think is a really, really good way of bringing people across. It's amazing how libertarian people are in their own space. If you talk to Uber drivers, they all sound like libertarians. I'm sure they're not. But that's another thing that you can do is to talk to people about how the state imposes particular obligations in their field of interest. I think we've got to recruit. It's amazing how much political parties. I mean, how's the Liberal Party in Victoria got 13,000 members? They're not values members. A lot of them aren't values members. But we've got to recruit people who are committed to those sorts of values. And I think really the only way that you do that is through showing how practically freedom works.
So of those 13,000 members, of the people you know within the Liberal Party and the Liberty Movement and all that sort of stuff, how many of them actually support any of the current, the direct action, plain packaging, all those sort of policies? Because there wasn't much dissent when those things came through. Apart from a couple of backbenchers.
Yeah, so
all the main people in the party that I know completely opposed.
yeah, one of the problems is that dissent is not valued, and I think that the only way that you can really change that is by example. So a lot of people have said to me, how are you going to balance these competing interests that you've got. You work at the IPA and you've got to criticise the Liberal Party when they don't do good things, and you're also going to be Young Liberal president. And to me, there's no distinction there. I mean, there's a slight distinction in emphasis sometimes when you're in the media. You've got to be a little bit careful. But the reality is, most of the time, you're going to be able to say, I can say the things that I say at the IPA, and I can say at the Liberal Party, and there's never any consequences. And there's certainly not the sort of consequences that people think there's going to be. People sort of obsess about this, and they worry about their political careers and that sort of thing. And I think that holds a lot of people back. But if I've learned anything over the last year, it's that those consequences aren't anywhere near as big as people think they are. And I've been told by people within the party that they think it's a really great thing that dissent is happening. I mean, it's the only way that having a contest of, we're serious about having a contest of ideas. It's the only way to get good policy. And I think I'm pushing for this culture of dissent to happen more. Criticising the party is not a bad thing. We're not a football team. At the end of the day, we're here because we want to see good policy. And there are going to be bad decisions that we make, and you don't just barrack for your team. That's not what it's about. We'll see if I'm successful at the end of this year.
So earlier today, your IPA comrade Julie was assaulting the virtues of a fully voluntary society, and of course Julie's correct. But could you tell us why you think she's wrong and why you hate freedom?
I'm probably a minutist, so I think that government should essentially have a defence force that should protect private property rights, and people are shaking their heads. This is students for anarchy. I mean, that's my position on, and I do recognise that it is philosophically inconsistent, and the space that government takes up, or that the state takes up in my philosophy, has been shrinking and shrinking over a period of time. And,
I understand your philosophy, but the question is why? Why is she wrong?
Because I think we, in order to protect private property rights, I think we need a court system, we need a legal framework to protect these things.
And why can't we do that private?
I guess they don't have legal power.
Well, just
Because
before
I
we
think
go
we
on for a
need-
debate about anarchy versus anarchy, maybe we should have a morning tea, and then you can have a real debate about that at some point.
I was looking to be Liberal Party affiliation.
If you came out as an anarchist right now, I'd be great on the H tomorrow. So are we doing?
Yeah, we're gonna have a morning tea. That I think.
We have a lot of points.
Well,
Yes.
I can.